I thought I was bit by a spider once, but I actually think I just had ringworm.
I mean, maybe you're a spider woman. You
yeah,
never
maybe.
know.
Wait, how do you do the hand thing?
Check.
I'm just flipping the camera off. Yeah, no. Before you, connected it back to sci-fi, I was like, is Great Gatsby sci-fi? I don't know if I'd say that.
I mean, the Great Gatsby, the green light, UFO.
Actually, no, literally, because actually, Great Gatsby, the rights were, became public domain recently. So if you guys want to rewrite, Great Gatsby as a sci-fi, go ahead. You're allowed to. You can make the green light, literally a UFO.
Yeah.
I don't know, Gatsby could be, an alien, and he's trying to go back to his home planet. I don't know.
And then he thinks that everybody says, "Oh, sport."
Oh, yeah.
Right? He is.
There we go.
Very alien-like.
Diana just burped.
Hey! Jinx. I'll leave that in.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Chai Chatter. On today's menu, we'll be discussing the philosophy of sci-fi movies, with a side of various warm beverages. What do you have today, ladies?
I have chai tea. I feel like because we're returning from a month break, I should go back to the classic.
I have Earl Grey, and it's very hot, so I can't drink it yet.
I have also a chai. I have a little chai tea latte.
Ooh, very fancy.
Okay.
All right, so basically what we're thinking of doing in this episode is we each have kind of researched on our own a sort of sci-fi trope, and then what we're going to do is discuss the sci-fi trope, what it is, and then the philosophical implications of it, and then we're kind of going to have a little bit of a discussion just on our thoughts.
So the sort of aspect or trope of sci-fi that I want to dive into is hyper-intelligent robots and forms of AI. So this trope, I think, is super popular. I'd argue it's probably the most popular about the ones we're going to be discussing today. Movies like Terminator, WALL-E, literally every Star Wars movie has a character that's either, robot or AI. Before we get into the philosophy of individual robots in movies, I just kind of want to discuss why we think that maybe this trope is so popular to begin with, because that's really going to benefit us when we get into the philosophy stuff.
I think the reason, you know how certain horror tropes are very popular because they deal with the macabre, they deal with morbid curiosity. I think that AI, and especially the sort of horrific futuristic AI scenarios, just appeal to the human imagination and more so the human fear, I guess.
I think the other reason would also be it is possible, it is a possibility for the future. It's something that we can see the development towards. So then people go, oh, that could be something that happens, and it sort of can make it more realistic of a story, even though it's sci-fi.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that definitely one of the reasons why this trope is so popular is just because of how grounded it is in reality. I mean, literally think, people have, robots, Roombas running around in their households these days. So it's what's the next step? And these movies, they sort of, again, they fill that morbid curiosity. They tell us what could be the next step. So, and again, this is nothing new. Ever since the creation of, computers, and even before then, people have always been wondering, if or when our man-made machines surpass, even us.
You notice how in a lot of literature and media, there's this common theme across genres, which is very human-centric. So the plotline will be exploring some other sort of being, be it an alien or AI, and how they lack a certain humanity. And then the narrative is always that, humans, despite our flaws, there's something special about us,
Yeah, there's
that sets us apart. And then, and then these movies always, it's a struggle between perfection and humanity. And in the end, it always sympathizes with humanity.
Okay, any other thoughts on the why? Or should we just kind of get into it?
I think we're good to
Let's get into it.
Okay. So, one thing that I've noticed is that a lot of sci-fi movies with robots and AI, they focus, again, on the relationship between humans and robots. And I kind of made a list of, like, because I've noticed that, like, robots and AI in these movies, they kind of fill out, like, 3-ish roles. Like, you might disagree with me, you might have another idea, and then you can bring that up. But these are the 3 that I kind of notice the most. So the first one is like a person who's like a support or companion type character. So like think like C-3PO or R2-D2 from Star Wars. And these characters to me are heavily humanized. Whenever a companion character isn't humanized, I think they're like animalized, because so many times do I see like a robot character in a movie that like acts like a dog or like a cat or something.
I can think of like Wall-E and Baymax too. Like they are children's characters and they are so endearing.
Yes, exactly. And then the next one that I could think of is like a main character who kind of struggles with their identity of a robot. And they are also humanized. One example I can think of is like Astro Boy or whatever. Because, again, he's a robot, and throughout the movie he kind of struggles with his identity. But at the end of the day, he is very human-like. He has a lot of personality. He just, has some robot parts. And then the very last one is, like, a cold and calculating, like, villain character. Like, who's super, objective and not very, human-like at all. Yeah.
Like the Ultrons.
Disagree? Yeah, the Ultrons of the robot trope. The fact that is most interesting to me is that the character that is the most robot-like and the one that is the least humanized is the one that's evil.
Yeah.
Because it brings up questions of whether or not, humans and robots really can be compatible, or if they can have like, a positive relationship with one another. And kind of what I want to go into is I picked like 2 movies that I think really kind of delve into like whether or not humans and robots can like actually be in a relationship with one another. And that is Her and Ex Machina. The movie Her, if you haven't seen it, but I don't know, if anyone who's watching hasn't seen it, it's about this dude, Theodore, who basically falls in love with like his Siri, his like AI operating system. And they sort of like begin a relationship with one another. And it really does seem like both of them are in love with one another, but there's sort of this twist at the end where Theodore finds out that like he sort of thought that her love for him was just like a fluke in her programming or something, but in reality he finds out that like she is simultaneously in relationships with like hundreds of other people around the world, and it is part of her programming. So it's kind of, and it's like, heartbreaking. So the kind of fact is the operating system, who in the movie, her name is Samantha, although she can sort of, simulate love, she really can't feel it. And this sort of relates to something that you brought up, I think, in the last kind of philosophy-related episode, which is like the black and white room, where like someone can study, like everything about a color, but if they live in a black and white room, they lack the experience of actually seeing that color. And that's sort of the point that I guess the movie makes, because, although she knows everything about love, it's at the end of the day, it's not love, it's programming.
I think it's super interesting how, in order to rationalize it or kind of like make the love feel more real, he believes that it was a programming error. Like it's not kind of built into her. It was some sort of like rebellion against her code. And then the second thing is that it's hard for us as humans to think of like what we experience as programming. We think of love as mystical and magical, but in reality, it has a lot to do with the hormones in our brain, our neural pathways, our like the experiences that we grew up with. And so like what sets us apart from just straight up robots is that we think, that we make our choices.
That's true.
So if we have a robot that thinks that they're in love and can simulate it, what part can we exactly discount that it's not real love,
Actually, that relates a lot to the next movie I'm going to talk about, because that's actually like a sort of philosophical thing that they discuss, Ex Machina. So the plot of Ex Machina is that there's this dude, I think his name's Caleb, and he gets invited to this like billionaire CEO's house to basically give his robot the Turing test. And we're going to talk about what the Turing test is in a second. But yeah, they make that point exactly because the character Caleb is like talking about her programming or whatever and asking, you know, like, oh, is she actually like this, or is she just programmed? Like, are you programming her to flirt with me or whatever? And then the billionaire sort of responds with like, if you think about it, you as a human, you have programming. You are programmed, you know, by either nurture or nature to be heterosexual. Like, it's not my problem you're attracted to her, basically. So yeah, it's kind of like that idea, like, how different are we from robots, really? And also, they actually bring up the black and white room example in Ex Machina too, and that's because like what happens throughout the plot of Ex Machina is that as he begins to like give her the Turing test, Caleb begins to like fall in love with this robot whose name is Ava. By the way, and again, it does really seem like she's in love with him, and she's like super scared and she's like afraid of the billionaire guy. So eventually Caleb breaks her out of the facility only for the billionaire to tell him that he wasn't actually brought here to conduct a Turing test. It was actually it wasn't a Turing test of sorts, but just not like a question and answer one. It was to see if she was basically programmed with the sole intention of getting out of that facility. So she did everything that she could to sort of make him fall in love with her so that she would let him free. Sort of just getting into like what the Turing test is. There's this test, and it's to see whether or not a robot has a mind. So basically, if you can ask a robot a series of questions and their answers are indistinguishable from a human's, then they have passed the Turing test. So I guess the question that remains with the story is, does Ava pass the Turing test? Because on one hand, she is able to, you know, really simulate human emotion so well that she's able to convince this dude that she's in love with him and that they need to escape together or whatever. But on the other hand, although we find out that she is only simulating that feeling, she's not feeling that actual feeling like a real human.
I mean, that once again brings up the issue of what can you define then as love? Because it's possible that we as humans, we could all experience it in very different ways. And then, so how can you discount that robot's feelings? What if that is love to a robot, like love between people is different? People experience that in different ways.
And I mean, a human that lacks the capacity for empathy, say they were born with psychopathy, right? What distinguishes them from this robot necessarily if they are able to simulate and pretend, right? So and the other thing is, I think that we glorify our capacity to feel, and we call it feeling instead of just programming, because nature is the one that has programmed us through many, many years. If, for example, we design robots, right, and then we kind of like simulated almost a natural selection sort of environment and just let them evolve on their own, eventually they will get to a point just as we are. I think we discredit their feelings of love and any sort of emotion because we have control over that. But if we simply created them and let them continue to evolve, at some point the line would really be blurred.
I do agree. We're definitely both programmed, but it is in different ways because robots can only understand like syntactic properties, like they can only understand like the shapes and like, I don't know, outward properties of things, but us humans, we understand like semantic ones, so like content and meaning and like connotation and stuff. So
but then
like
but then the question arises, what happens if a robot can do that?
Well, can they? Is that
and it's
possible?
already starting to
Exactly.
Yeah. They basically what they've done is they've pretty much taken all of the data that is in the human brain and try to replicate that in a robot, which is entirely possible, right? The more that we understand about our own brain, the more that we can definitely program something to be that way.
And then I guess the last question is, because what we've kind of come to the conclusion here, I guess, is that maybe it doesn't matter that she passed the Turing test or that she didn't pass the Turing test, because even if robots don't have the same mind as us, maybe that's not what the end goal should be. It's just they have their own sort of, you know, robot, again, like syntactic mind.
And what you make me think of, actually, that is a really, really good like story for AI and humanity is Westworld, because and I've only seen the first season, but at the end, basically, I think they outline 4 stages of consciousness. So there's like, I'm trying to remember. So there's like thought, right? There's memory. And then the very last stage that takes them to the most realistic or the closest point of humanity is suffering. That was the whole philosophical kind of thesis of Westworld, was that by the end of season 1, like a bunch of robots kind of break out, and it is like, number one, if a robot has memory, that means the experiences actually matter to them. They have a kind of accumulated identity, free will to make their own choices, and the capacity to suffer. Because like understanding the capacity to suffer gives these robots a whole bunch of different meaning to their existence,
and like
beyond what they're programming.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
Okay. And then just sort of as a little closing statement, I just want to again stress how the reason why these movies are so effective is because of like, as, you know, as crazy and as absurd as some of the ideas in them are, like, they're very much grounded in reality. Because again, in this movie Ex Machina, the CEO guy, he designs Ava's face based on like Caleb's search history, because the billionaire CEO guy, he owns like Blue Book, which is like basically the their Facebook equivalent of Google. No, Google, it's a like a search engine. The billionaire CEO, he programs Ava's like facial movements by looking like through the webcams of like computers and stuff. So again, like the reason why this the reason why it's like so spooky, it's because like right now in the present there are so many concerns about like privacy, and again like connecting it to Facebook and like all their privacy breaches, and Google, and how like easy it is to access. Like the thing is, what I think is kind of creepy is there's like a feature on like Google where you can see all the assumptions that Google has made about you based on your searches, which is so creepy. Like they'll have like what they think your like your marital status is. They'll have like what they think your interests are, like your age group. Like it's super creepy.
I think that the only reason that people haven't entirely canceled that is because like now we know that we can access it and turn it off. I think like, I believe you actually are turning it off, but there's always that possibility that then it just is making it not public, you know?
I think we talk so much about, you know, this hypothetical future world where AI runs our lives, but what we don't realize is it already runs our lives.
That's
like
true.
Every single website, you know, just any part of the digital world is run by algorithms. And even if, say, you know, you disable these things on Google, you don't click the terms and services, which they kind of like force you to. Like they hide a bunch of stuff in the terms and services, and you're essentially signing your personhood away to be sold, right? And every single user on Facebook, all of their data is worth around $9. Yeah. So you are worth, your entire life and identity and information is worth $9 to Facebook. So that's great. But like, you know, it's not just the fact that they track us and like invade our privacy, but our opinions and thoughts are also influenced by the algorithm. So, I mean, AI already kind of controls us in that way. If they had uploaded all of the data from the internet onto an AI, they would very easily be able to replicate human thought, right? Just all of your Google searches, like your patterns of behavior, they already have all that data in store.
And think about like the see if you're a robot things. They're constantly having to update those because the robots learn to do them.
That's true.
Yeah.
And one last thing I just wanted to say, well, a few last things, but like you mentioned how like you could definitely build a robot out of like what you search on Google. That's totally true, because in the movie they even say the billionaire says that like, I'm not programming her based on the results you find when you search. I'm programming her based on the questions people ask and like the way they ask the questions, which I think is super interesting, because even that is very revealing about people. And just one thing, I feel like a lot of times when I saw that page of like all the things that Google knows about me, I was like, so what, right? Like who cares that they know I like this and that, and like who cares they know like my age or whatever, like why does it really matter? But when you watch these type of movies, it reminds you why it matters, because in this movie the main character, Caleb, he leaves his search history on or whatever, and it basically leads to him, like, the robot abandoning him in this billionaire's house, and then he starves to death. So, yeah, that's why these movies are so creepy and effective. And I think as long as humanity continues to have these concerns and fears about privacy and about robots and AI, these movies are just going to keep on getting made, and different, angles to this philosophy are just going to continue to be discovered, I guess.
Yeah.
And honestly, probably the reason they are going to be made so often is because it's profitable, because people are worried about it. It's about the profit. That's really what
exactly,
it comes down to for movies.
I mean, it's so sinister, isn't it? It's that, like, they profit from us genuinely fearing this, but they also profit from us, like, watching entertainment about how much we fear it,
Yeah.
So for my topic, I'm doing the trope of the everyman. So this is a character who is not always the protagonist, but is often the protagonist, and kind of works as a blank slate. So it's an ordinary enough person that it can be related to the average viewer is the goal. And this is done usually by having secondary issues like love, work, school, like, very mundane issues beyond whatever giant sci-fi thing is going on. They have that little, it might not be a continuous subplot, but maybe from the beginning they'll be like, I'm having such a hard time with school. It's, oh, look, aliens, Like it has that little bit of mundane sense to the start of their story or throughout their story as a subplot to, like, make them relatable, as well as a character. They don't have too much whimsy to them. They don't have anything that's sort of interesting or wacky to, like, make them unique from anyone else. It just sort of, they're there as a vessel for the story, not really there to be an interesting character. So, I mean, I like kind of Diana's, like, why do you think they do that? Why do you guys think they do this?
To be honest, I do think it's pretty much just lazy writing, For this story, most of the time it's about the plot, or rather, not even the plot, it's about the premise. It's about, look at this movie. It's about aliens landing on Earth and taking over, or it's about giant nuclear warheads and blah, blah, blah. So they want sort of a protagonist that doesn't interfere with the plot in any way and doesn't seem like he would act in any, I guess, like, unconventional way.
Because they know about as little as the audience does, like, slowly having that character kind of, like, learn about, like, the sci-fi elements or whatever is, like, a good way for the watcher or the reader to get exposed to it too. Yeah, exposition.
Some of the things I sort of found on why they do this is, first of all, the audience immediately recognizes it as a trope, either consciously or subconsciously. They see it and they're like, oh, this is a very basic person. I'm supposed to attach onto them. I'm supposed to see myself in their place. This is supposed to be a person that I'm supposed to relate to. And that little subconscious connection's made immediately. So it makes it easier to root for this character because you now are seeing them as you. If they aren't super, like, any super strong beliefs, well, then you can just put your own beliefs onto them.
Yeah.
It's sort
of
of
like Y/N.
Yeah.
Inject your
It's literally like a reader. But there is a huge difference between an average, authentic, relatable character and just, like, a literal potato sack.
Yeah. And
a literal piece of wood,
The superhero
like
thing
Bella from Twilight.
The superhero thing was a great thing to say, because one of the greatest, like, examples of it is Peter Parker's Spider-Man.
Yeah.
Because he's just this teenage kid going to school, and oops, a science experiment went wrong and he got bit by a spider. Like, people get bit by spiders. That's the thing that happens. So it's a very mundane start to an extraordinary thing. His morals throughout the thing are very, I want to do the right thing. It's a very easy thing just to be like, yeah, of course you want to do the right thing. Like, it's nothing crazy. It's nothing super strong or, like, you need to have been there to understand it. It's a very simplistic way so that the audience understands. So far, the everyman that I've described pretty much can work into any genre so far. This is a very common thing everywhere in stuff. But in sci-fi, it sort of has a slightly different rule, a slightly more, like, logical reason why. Because as Glenda said, it often can be chopped down to lazy writing. But in sci-fi, there's actually
Mm-hmm.
a couple more reasons that make a bit more sense. The first thing is, if you're making a sci-fi world where you need to know a lot of things really quick to make a good world building. A lot of stories, if they have like a good character, they kind of have to give up on some of that world building and hope that maybe people have read a book about this thing, you know, like hope that they have previous knowledge to help build that. So by having like not having to spend a bunch of time explaining a character's backstory and motives and complexities, they have more time to work on building the world and creating the different systems that exist.
Yeah, and I think like so two sci-fi movies that I can think of that have really, really well developed characters are like what's his face? That guy from Inception.
Oh yeah.
Cobb, right? And the Matthew McConaughey in Interstellar, both Chris Nolan movies. But those movies are made all the better by sort of the human aspect of it. Just like it's their humanity juxtaposed against this crazy sci-fi scenario.
And that's like one of the other reasons, which is having like this really basic human, very relatable character. It's less jarring when you put in all of those sci-fi elements. So the last thing I have specific to sci-fi is that putting these everymen or every woman into these extreme situations when they're so mundane, the sci-fi element, it makes people go, oh, I don't know what I would do then. And then that creates this sympathy for the character. It's just from going from something so plain to something so extreme, that's how the sympathy is made. So on to some of my discussion points. So one of the things that is really common when you have a really vanilla protagonist, we have a very boring protagonist that's simple, they don't have anything that's really thought-provoking about them, is that then audiences attach on a fandom side to the supporting characters. They like create fan fiction stuff about the supporting characters over the protagonist. So then that leads to the question, are these protagonists worth having instead of like maybe if it's a protagonist and a bunch of people that help them out, why not just do an ensemble like movie with the people who help them out?
Yeah, that's true. Especially in like sci-fi and like a lot of movies actually that has like an ensemble in it or like book or whatever, like hardly anyone ever thinks the main character is like considers them their favorite character, and that's pretty telling about like you know, probably how bland the main characters are.
Like, if you think about a novel like The Great Gatsby, where Nick, the narrator, is the main character, I feel like I think his like blandness and almost sort of impartiality is, I guess, like a literary technique so as to make all of the other colorful characters more vibrant around him.
Yeah, no. Before you like connected it back to sci-fi, I was like, is Great Gatsby sci-fi? I don't know if I'd say that.
Oh, no. Great Gatsby's not sci-fi. That's just like in general in literature. I mean, the Great Gatsby, the green light, UFO.
Actually, because actually, like, Great Gatsby, like, the rights were, like, became public domain recently. So if you guys want to rewrite, like, Great Gatsby as a science, like, a sci-fi, go ahead. Like, you're allowed to. Like, you can make the green light, like, literally a UFO.
Yeah. Great Gatsby fanfiction about Tom.
Like, I don't know, Gatsby could be, like, an alien, and he's trying to go back to his home planet. I don't know.
And then he thinks that everybody says "old sport." Like,
oh,
you know,
yeah.
Right? He is.
There we go.
Very alien-like.
With these topics, the every man or every woman is usually based off of what the writer and director, what their perception of the average person is. So when you think about, especially over the last, 50 years, you're looking at a lot of straight white men. Hence why you see the Peter Parkers, the Wade Watts from Ready Player One, like those sort of things where, because a lot of these writers are straight white men, or from book adaptations, a lot of the writers are, young white females. Like, you have these very archetypal characters being these every people. It's diversity kind of goes out the window immediately. So is this then a big enough detriment that it is not worth having these characters, and we'd be better off finding a trope that is more open to diversity.
I think because we are almost so used to seeing the teenage white male be the protagonist of everything, that he really has become the most blank and accessible character. Not because he actually is, but because you're just so used to, it's like when you hear a name like Matthew or Dylan or Andrew, you don't associate anything with it. Whereas if you had a name like Esmeralda, that name by itself carries a lot of connotation with it. Same as if you had a main character that was like an African American mother of two or something, I guess even though it's sad, at this point, if they wanted to go for the blank slate, the straight white male makes sense because he really does not have any connotation attached to him.
I agree. So, it's easier to just write like a everyman type of character, but it's it's more interesting and it's much more realistic to have a character that is actually like people are, and that's filled with personality, not a blank slate. And honestly, I think people underestimate, I think that certain people think that you need to be exactly like a character in order to relate to them, but in actuality, you might not have anything, in common with a main character, but maybe you still relate to them just because you feel sympathy for them. I don't know, I think that we need more interesting main characters in sci-fi.
During the 2010s, there was that big wave of, especially young adult novels being turned into things, and all of those were extremely just white characters plus maybe a black friend. It was years and years and years of all the sci-fi movies just being extremely white. It was just the thing that happened. And I think it's kind of sad to think about the effects that's had on our society of creating those, oh yeah, white's the default. Oh yeah, that's just the default character. The blank slate, oh, it's a straight white man or a boring, not like other girl female,
Oh yeah, that's the female equivalent. Is it like a what is it? Tris from Divergent type of character.
Yeah. Okay, teach me about string theory. I'm ready.
So my topic is going to be about string theory, but the trope itself is sort of the multiverse, the multiple parallel worlds theory. I did a whole 20-minute presentation on string theory in 8th grade, but I'm kind of gonna refresh a little bit. So the smallest particles that we know about so far are called the elementary particles. These include quarks, leptons, bosons, and they're way too small for us to observe, because in order to observe something, we have to see it, right? And in order to see something, light has to bounce off of it. So, whenever we look at something, where our eyeballs are actually touching the thing through light. These particles are literally too small for the light photons to bounce off of. So we actually do not know the true nature of the smallest building blocks of matter. And then this uncertainty is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. But currently there are two big models for the theory of everything. One is quantum mechanics. And what quantum mechanics has done is that they have imagined particles to be single points in a system. And through that, they've been able to answer a whole bunch of different questions and explain 3 out of the 4 fundamental forces of the universe. The 4 fundamental forces being the strong force, the weak force, the electromagnetic force, and gravity. However, quantum mechanics has not been able to account for gravity whatsoever. And that is where Einstein's theory of relativity comes in. That is the second big theory of everything. When physicists try to plug in, or when they try to account for gravity in quantum mechanics, all of their math breaks down. So string theory is essentially the attempt to make a theory of everything and account for all of these different forces in our universe. So when physicists imagine particles as points in a system, that's called the standard model. But this is the question they kind of proposed is, what is more complex than a point? A string! Dun dun dun! String theory. And then basically, in the same way that different vibrations on a guitar give you different notes, different vibrations of these strings will give you different particles. That's kind of the way that they like to imagine it. However, the catch is, all right, string theory only works out, the math only checks out in a universe with 11 dimensions. Womp, womp, womp. So this is where the kind of dimension area goes. So just to preface is that string theory currently does not work out with everything. You know, again, because it requires all of these different conditions that we have not been able to prove yet, but it can kind of like help us learn about a lot of different things. So now I will explain the dimensions. All right, so first imagine a dot or a point in a single system of things. This is essentially the 0th dimension, right? It's just a singular point. And then imagine an infinite series of points. What does that make? It makes a line, and that's the 1st dimension. You go back and forth on this line. And then imagine an infinite series of lines. That makes a plane. This is 2D, the 2-dimensional world. And then imagine an infinite series of planes stacked on top of each other. That makes a cube. That is the 3-dimensional world. And now we come to, so we imagine like our universe is built in 3D, but we also go through time. And time is, if you imagine these 3-dimensional worlds as single points, but you create a line out of them, right? You can go back and forth in 3-dimensional worlds. That is the 4th dimension. The 5th dimensional world is where you get to a plane of these different timelines, essentially parallel universes. And then the 6th dimension is if you have, like if you stack these timeline planes on top of each other and you can time travel between these parallel universes. And then the 7th dimension is where we imagine universes with entirely different start conditions. So instead of starting from the timeline of the Big Bang, it is the Big Crunch. And then the 8th dimension is if we imagine we can travel and hop between these different universes with entirely different start conditions. And then honestly, beyond like 8, 9, 10, 11, it's nobody has a clue. 9th dimension, it's like universes with entirely different laws of physics. So planets are made out of squares. The speed of light is equal to 12, you know, etc. The 10th dimension is if you have a single point with everything in it. Everything. Ever. So if you think of the 0th dimension as a point containing absolutely nothing, the 10th dimension would be a point containing everything. And then the 11th dimension, nobody knows. My first question, I really like Diana's, is why do you think that this trope is so popular? This sort of idea of being able to hop to alternate realities and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. I don't really know about alternate realities, but like, for me, the 4th dimension one is super interesting because there's a lot of sci-fi movies that like follow that, like, and books too. Like, for example, like Arrival, which is a movie I really love, and Slaughterhouse 5, where basically they both sort of, they have like either like a creature that can, they both have like a creature that exists within the 4th dimension, which means they experience time all at once. And the reason why I think that is so interesting to us humans is because in both of these kind of like this book and movie, it kind of talks about like grief and stuff and how that kind of gives us a different kind of perspective on it, because obviously as humans, grief is something that we struggle with a lot. So in order to like see a piece of media that kind of gives us a way to, because to me at least, like having this thing where, you know, if like someone is lost in the 4th dimension, like where time is happening all at once, you're still with them. That's just really comforting to me.
This makes me think of the DC TV show universe, where they're, especially connected to the show Flash, there's various versions of the Flash, there are various versions of all the other characters. Like, I guess spoiler for basically any Flash stuff, there's a big plot point called Flashpoint, where the Flash goes back in time and he keeps his mom from dying. So he ends up discovering with that by his mom living that day, it didn't make things better in the future. It ended up actually making things worse in a lot of aspects. So even though he got that one thing he wanted he got to see why his reality was so good, or relatively why there are things that are better in one reality than another, and to be thankful.
And do you think that morality still exists? If we think of morality as sort of the sense that we make of the world, in the choices that we make, the way that we assess different things and judge things, if there is such a world where everything exists simultaneously, does morality kind of break down?
I think that the existence of like a multiverse just in itself kind of, if anything, supports the fact that morality is important. Because again, you're able to see like the differences that choices make, therefore, pointing out the importance of making good choices.
If our decisions are impacting things, then choosing to do the better thing or the thing that you believe to be more morally correct, then you can have that in your mind as an assumption that that's the better path. So then, if that's the better path, it would make sense to do that. Yeah, morality is so fluid, it depends. People have different opinions on what is moral, what is not. But still, if you're following your own morals, then you're following a reality that's closer to what you believe is right.
Yeah. In order to be like existential in like the way you're talking about, it would need to be like a sci-fi movie or book where like no matter what the character does in each sort of reality, there's the same outcome. Then that would sort of become existential.
Yeah, and the biggest thought experiment, again, just circling back to Rick and Morty, it's where, like, you take an individual that maintains the same level of consciousness, being able to kind of jump back and forth between these different realities. Even though that is an adventure that they're going through, it also cripples them with this sense of almost being lost, like they don't belong to something, they don't have any meaning attached to them. Do you think it would be best to stay ignorant of this?
I think like some awareness about them is good. Like again, I was kind of talking about the beginning, like the fourth dimension, having an awareness about like everything that has happened and will happen. That can be obviously like very therapeutic. Like there's this, in the book, there's like the aliens, the Tremalfadorians, I think they're called. And again, they view everything in the fourth dimension. So whenever someone dies, they say, so it goes. So I feel like that maybe that's kind of a comforting, it can be very comforting, just like when you lose someone again, just to be like obviously you're allowed to be sad about it, but maybe you're not so far away from them as you think they are, because somewhere in, another dimension or in another part of the fourth dimension, you're still with them,
I mean, I would think that there would also be a toll on knowing that. Because think about going back to Marvel, the Sorcerer and Doctor Strange, they can see an almost infinite amount of timelines just by, taking a second and seeing all the decisions that could be made. You're seeing realities where things are so much worse than you can imagine. Or if you knew everything that's going to happen in your timeline, future and past, then as if things are going to decline. If things start to decline, then you're left with that dread of that's what's coming.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I get that. I think maybe then what I mean is that like maybe the best version is just the way it is now, where we have sci-fi movies which allow us to sort of dream about these ideas of still being with people we've lost, but we're not really sure if it exists or not,
I think your point about using this, this can be therapeutic, but probably only in the context that your present reality is miserable, it's like a means to escape. Some people instead of believing in alternate realities, they believe in a heaven or a god or something that, or karma that enacts justice and makes it so that, everything they've lost has not actually been lost. But if you lived in a reality where you had a super duper happy family and you won the lottery, but you became aware of all of the other realities where you didn't, or you were a terrible person or something, then your beliefs about yourself are kind of challenged because you're you're no longer grounded to this idea that you have about your life and who you are, because there could easily exist a reality where you're totally not, right? So I guess it depends on what kind of place you are at in your life.
Yeah, I guess it's less about looking into the past actually in these movies and books, more so just like everything. So the present, the future, the past, that sort of loses meaning. It's just your life altogether in 1 second. So it's not really like living in the past. It's just, it's literally living in the moment, but the moment is everything.
Part of being human is just wanting to know, but not necessarily needing an immediate answer.
Yeah, as detached as sci-fi stories tend to be from, you know, our world and reality, somehow they're like the most human thing that we can create, if you think about it that way.
Kind of similar to horror, in that horror appeals to, you know, the visceral fears. I think what sci-fi explores is our existential fears, cosmic horror, the stuff that has to do with, you know, the entire context of our lives.
That's true.
Thank you all for watching this episode of Chai Chatter and watching us get deep while the tea steeps. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe, do all that good stuff, and come back again for our next episode. Cheers!